goes. I have some material, but let's see. So from Plato, we have some 600,000 words today extant. Let's start with, a very dry and very controversial fact, so to speak, 600,000 words. You can compare that with Aristotle's corpus, which is not, obviously, it's not the whole of his writing, but we have 1 million words from Aristotle, more or less. These both are extremely high numbers for ancient texts, obviously, but that's a good beginning point. I take these numbers from Jean Irigoyen, which basically takes it from the internet. He just used some internet motors to come up with these numbers. Maybe that's not that important. But what is important is that almost all of this corpus comes in forms of dialogues. I find that to be very, very unusual, very weird, and it's very consistent. It's pretty consistent. It feels like Plato wrote dialogues and he was committed to write dialogues almost all his life. So that already should tell us something about, or should raise a question about what this person is up to. And it should raise an unusual question. We are dealing with a very, very unusual philosopher, very, very unusual writer. So 600,000 words, roughly 30, 35 dialogues, none of which puts Plato on stage. That's yet another layer of weirdness. And none of which I think puts a mouthpiece of Plato on stage. We have Socrates on stage, that is true, but it's pretty questionable. Well, we can debate about that, whether Socrates is Plato's mouthpiece. If he is Plato's mouthpiece, then what's the reason of the form of the dialogue and so on. But without making any presumptions, I'm just trying to state the fact that Plato never speaks in his own dialogues, which cover most of his corpus today. From these little 2-3 facts, we can deduce one duality in Plato's corpus, and that is that on the one hand, we have the philosophical content. It's usually, it's what I will call the dogmatic aspect of the Platonic corpus. Dogmatic, not in the sense that he's just being stubborn or anything, but it's just that there you have the doctrines, the ideas, the arguments, the conceptual stuff, the stuff that you can extrapolate, the stuff that seems context independent. So that's one constant aspect of this 600,000 words divided into 30, 35 dialogues. The other aspect is the dramatic aspect. Because it's a dialogue and because it's not Plato himself speaking, other people are speaking, fictional or non-fictional, and this is another constant. It's constant in the sense that somebody else is speaking all the time. Not always the dramatic aspect is as predominant as it is in other dialogues, but still these are two basic aspects that I find to be irreducible to one another. And if we're talking about Plato, we have to start by recognizing that these two aspects exist. On the one hand, we have a conceptual content that is being discussed. On the other hand, it's like a play, it's like a tragedy. There are characters, there's an interaction between them. They have their own personality. They have a particularity. They come from somewhere. They're trying to do something. So it's very literary, obviously, in that way. So the dramatic aspect and the dogmatic aspect are two constants in the Platonic corpus as I understand it, basically. And actually, when you look at the reception of Plato in history, and now I'm drawing on the works of Tigerstate and Theslev and Gonzalez mostly, you can see that either people emphasize the dramatic aspect or they emphasize the dogmatic aspect. I have been in Turkey, I have been somewhat vocal in emphasizing the dramatic aspect, saying that one should not neglect it, one should not simply reduce it to the dogmatic aspect, to the doctrines and so on. now I still have the same idea. I still have the same position, but I am becoming more and more convinced that the dogmatic aspect or the dramatic aspect, we have to think about how these two aspects relate to one another. How the fact that this character says something, how that relates to the issue at hand, the conceptual content of the discussion. So that I open for discussion, basically. These texts will confront you with this duality. And we as readers, as interpreters, as translators, we should pick up the question of how these two fit together. And we cannot just say, well, this is just Plato, just let's not talk about these other dramatic stuff, because they exist, because they are part of the corpus. And Plato was very persistent, very consistent about wanting to write dialogues, and we should respect that. That's my first, red line, really. We should respect Plato's will of doing this, and we should take it seriously. We shouldn't mystify it, but we shouldn't act as if it doesn't happen. So then the question is, how do we negotiate the relationship between these two aspects? And today I'd like to talk a little bit about book one in the context of this problem of the relationship between the dramatic aspect and the dogmatic aspect. Okay. So in the last 50 years or so, the dramatic aspect or the dramatic readings of Plato gained more and more traction in international Plato studies, according to Gerald Press, according to others. It feels like in the time of Vlastos, the dramatic aspect was just, you could just neglect it. You could take out arguments, and it was all about putting different arguments together. And if there are contradictions, what you do, you fall into developmentalism, in the sense that you would say, oh, Plato changed his mind. So if you come across a contradiction, you say, since Plato was believing these things, since these are Plato's doctrines, then he must have changed his mind over time. So that is why people talk about the chronology so much. The chronology becomes important because we want to figure out when Plato changed his ideas and so on and so forth. I find the questions of the chronology to be, I'm a little bit skeptical about that, to be honest. And I find them to be distracting most of the time. They distract us from talking about what the text says, what Plato writes, and so on. In the last 50 years, people seem to become more and more aware that we do not have the right to immediately say, reading in the text, blah, blah, blah. So Plato thinks that way. And if in another dialogue, another character says something contradictory, then, we have to figure out, maybe Plato is old, maybe Plato changed his mind. And we come up with an extra narrative that makes things more complicated, in my view. But if we take the dramatic aspect seriously, we can accommodate contradictory statements by different characters, or even by the same character in a Platonic dialogue. Is this a good time to sort of slow down and just look around and get a sense of there are questions? What I want to do, I want to point out to some parts of book one where the dramatic and the dogmatic aspects sort of get into some kind of relationship. Let me see.
Questions, comments?
Yeah.
Buyurun.
You can interrupt me, so I'm moving ahead as if...
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe it would help a little bit, and maybe not. And if you think this is a distraction or not helpful, please say so, Omer. I think that in modern scholarship, which is rooted in a new sort of scientific approach, which became modern philology, right, in the 19th century, we as scholars, we're looking for verifiable truth, scientifically verifiable truth. And so we tend to avoid questions of intent, right? We tend to avoid motivation, which is really what drama deals with. Why did somebody do this? You know,
Mm-hmm.
What were they thinking when they did it? What was the context, the historical context in which this person was doing? Was he or she acting freely? Or was it fate? You know, was it just a response to, you know, the terrible circumstances of the time? These are the sort of questions I think that Omer is grappling with when he contrasts dogmatic and dramatic. Perhaps, I don't know, but
pretty much. Because Plato puts us in a tight spot because he never speaks in his own voice, though. So either we ignore the fact that he doesn't speak in his own voice, or we just assume that he is. This is just Plato speaking. But I think in either way we do violence to the text because Plato is insistently pointing to the fact that it's not him speaking, he is making other people speaking. He wants us to be uncomfortable, basically. And this lack of comfort is quite reminiscent of the Socratic way of questioning and making people question their assumptions and so on. So I find this to be the development of Socratic annoyingness or something like that. And I think we should recognize it rather than just shut it off because it's so persistent. And in the Republic, there are so many dramatic things that you just can't ignore, basically. The question is, what are we going to do with these dramatic elements? How much are we going to weigh on them? Because although dramatic readings have gained in popularity since the time of Vlastos and so on, so everybody now seems to recognize, in the literature, seems to recognize that these texts are couched in dramatic frames that are set by Plato as a dramatist, basically. And everybody seems willing to take that into account. So no longer do we simply say Plato thinks, Plato's theory of recollection. People are careful enough to say that the theory of recollection voiced by Socrates in Plato's Phaedo and so on, that hedged way of speaking has now become more and more predominant, and I can ask maybe Damien about this, and he seems to be nodding, so I'm taking that as a good sign. But I am relying on Gerald Press's work on that. He has two papers on the state of the question of Platonic studies in the 60s and then in the 80s, or maybe in the 80s and then the 2000s. Anyhow, although it's true that we should not neglect the dramatic aspect, I've been working on the dramatic aspect for quite a while now. And I'm a little bit disappointed, I should say. I've been working on the people, their background, what they do, if they're fictions, their names, why they speak that way, and so on. So everything around the arguments I've been working on quite a bit. And they are very interesting and very rewarding in many ways. But I have come to the conclusion that the non-argumentative aspects of the text are still secondary with regard at the end of the day, but maybe we can talk about this later on. So, because the problem with the dramatic readings of Plato is that they are way too particular. They are so particular that, and they can turn into guessing games. As Victoria was saying, we're trying to guess what Plato is up to, and that can turn into me telling you my dream and you responding with your own dream. And it's hard to come to an agreement or a fruitful disagreement if we're just talking about particular dramatic elements. So what I'm trying to say, what I'm suggesting here is that how about in book one, we do not only look at the arguments, that's just the dramatic aspect. And we don't just look at the particular characters, let's say Cephalus and Polemarchus and Thrasymakhos and Socrates. We don't just look at the particulars, but we look at something in between, something that is not as particular or not as universal. My proposition for tonight is to emphasize to take as a unit of interpretation the relationships between characters. What I mean is this: when you look at the text, when you think about the text, think of how many different kinds of relationships are put on stage. Let me give the first, in the first famous sentence, I went down yesterday to the Piraeus. Everybody talks about this, the symbolism behind this first sentence, but not many people emphasize the meta there, the width, the fact that Socrates went to the Piraeus with Glaucon, son of Ariston. So there's a companionship there. They're going together. They went together to the Piraeus. And that is a willful, consensual companionship. That's the first kind of relationship. The other relationship that we find in the first sentence is that of a father and son. And I should tell you, this book is about fathers and sons. This book is about, how this happens, how, fathers, die and sons become fathers, and that transition. It's really a book, as I came to conclude, it's really a book about succession, how to make succession possible. So the father-son relationship is just extremely, extremely important, and it shows up in the first sentence. Then when you move on, when you think about the opening scene with Polemarchus telling the slave boy to stop Socrates and to hold him and to make him wait for him. So there you have different relationships coming in. First of all, master-slave relationships show up. What else? Master-slave relationship. And then Polemarchus says, Socrates, you're going back to Athens. I don't think so. Look at us, how many we are. So either overpower us or stay here. So that's a new relationship. That's a relationship between strong and weak, or maybe the majority and the minority. That could also be the case, but it's a power relationship, a very just brute power relationship. And that is already dramatically pointing towards much of the issue, the dogmatic issue of justice and how to ground justice in terms other than mere power. That's already, to use Jeffrey Bowes' term, it's proleptic in the sense that it is a foreshadowing. This is a dramatic foreshadowing of the conceptual dogmatic discussion of the nature of justice. Because there they just hold on to Socrates, they arrest Socrates, and Socrates asks Polemarchus, he says, well, what if we try to convince you that we have to do something super important in Athens? Can we convince you? And Polemarchus answers with a very interesting sentence saying that, can you convince people who do not listen to you? Interestingly, Socrates doesn't answer this question. Glaucon answers this question. He says, no, you cannot convince somebody who doesn't listen to you. But already you can see that dramatically we are being exposed to pretty much everything we need. I mean, it's all about the power of logos, the power of speech, and what happens when you're confronted with the limits of speech with somebody who isn't listening to you. What do you do then? That is already, for us philosophers, a huge question. So these are little dramatic pointers that show that something is being prepared, something is cooking in the kitchen somehow. And with regard to the relationships, as I said, I think it's nice to point out different relationships. Different family relations are at play. So Socrates' brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, they're brothers, and they are brothers to Plato. I said Socrates, I'm sorry. Plato, Glaucon, and Adeimantus are three brothers, and Glaucon and Adeimantus will be the main figures who draw the dialogue further. So there's a brotherhood going on there. There is a legal relationship of inheritance when Cephalus comes on stage. I am assuming that everybody knows the text mostly. So if that is not the case, I can sort of gloss into. I can gloss the story a little bit, but Cephalus speaks, and the issue of justice comes up, and Socrates questions Cephalus about what really justice is, and then Cephalus says, "Well, I have to go perform my sacrifices. Enough of this philosophy." And he says that you are inheriting my money. You're inheriting my argument. He hands over the argument to his son. So that's a legal relationship between an inheritor and his son. And then there are military alliances. These are metaphorical alliances. All along book one, you will always hear stuff like, "I will fight with you," or "I will fight against you," or "come on my side, go on that side, take up your weapons." And all that talk of switching alliances is yet another relationship that we find in book one. And finally, there's a relationship of partisanship, which is stronger than alliance. Immediately, you can see in the interaction between Socrates and Thrasymakhos, Cleitophon sides up with Thrasymakhos, and Polemarchus sides with Socrates. And you can see like two little camps fighting against one another. The reason why I think this relationship unit is interesting is because it's larger than the particular Cephalus, the particular Polemarchus, but it's not just an abstract idea. It still has some kind of concreteness to it. And when you think about it, all these relationships are already dramatic pointers to very important dogmatic questions. And the interesting thing about relationships in book one and later in the books that follow book one is that they change over time. So Polemarchus starts by arresting Socrates, but later on he becomes an ally of Socrates. Very quickly, actually, Polemarchus says, "Well, okay, I'm going to join you. I'm on your side. Let's fight," and that sort of thing. So you can see that the relationships change. First, he takes Socrates hostage. Then he becomes his ally. And things get very complicated when Thrasymakhos comes on stage. Thrasymakhos is the major character that I want to focus on. He's clearly hostile to Socrates at the beginning. We don't know exactly why, but he says he's very much frustrated with the general attitude of Socrates, his irony, the way he speaks, the fact that he never answers questions and so on. He always asks questions and so on. And then he starts out with the intention to tear Socrates to pieces out of anger. Socrates says that, at least. And maybe jealousy is there, maybe a relationship of competition is there. Then he reverts to sarcasm. And finally, towards the end of book one, you will remember that Thrasymakhos at the end says, "I'm just going to nod. I'm just going to say yes to whatever it is that you say. I don't care. You just talk, and I'll just serve you as much as I can. You feed yourself with your victory." And that's how book one ends. And at the end of book one, there's this very interesting paragraph where Socrates says, "We messed up. Actually, I messed up. I mean, I'm really not satisfied with where we are, although it appears that I won. I personally am guilty for this," because Socrates says, "I messed up when I stopped talking about what justice is, and I latched on to the other discussion of whether it's more profitable than injustice." So he says, I was greedy, and I switched, instead of talking about what justice is, I just moved on to assume that I know justice and talk about whether it's more profitable than injustice. All this to say, so you might be a little bit impatient. What I'm interested in is the following. So the end of book one is very bitter in the sense that Thrasymakhos is not listening to Socrates. He says, "To hell with you. The victory is yours. I don't care." It's bitter, and Socrates is not satisfied. And at the beginning of book two, Socrates says, "I thought that the discussion was over," but then Glaucon and Adeimantus take up Thrasymakhos' position, and they defend it for maybe nine books. So something very interesting is happening there. There's a new kind of relationship coming in. It's not a relationship of alliance, because Glaucon and Adeimantus emphasize that we do not agree with Thrasymakhos, but we want to hear a good case against it. And that's why we want you to, destroy Thrasymakhos' position. But first, we will build it up. We're going to play devil's advocate and so on. So what they're doing, they are engaging in a new relationship with Thrasymakhos. They are being devil's advocate. They are taking a philosophical stand with regard to an idea. They're saying that how about we defend this idea, although we do not agree with it, although we want it to be destroyed, let's take it up. This is a very new kind of relationship. And this was not there in book one at all. Neither Polemarchus was always taking sides. He almost never considers an idea without adhering to it or just opposing it or something. Similarly, Cephalus, and then Thrasymakhos is just a partisan. He's just biased, and that's part of his philosophy. So at the beginning of book two, we have a new relationship. And I will not go into all the details, but I'll just give you a sense of what Thrasymakhos is doing after the end of book one, because if he's so better, why is he hanging around? And we know that he's hanging around because Thrasymakhos almost never speaks in the rest of the books, but actually he does in book five. Let me see. Yeah, in book five, at the beginning of book five, there's the issue of the commonality of women, the commonality of children, the abolishment of family. That question comes up, and Thrasymakhos says, we all want to hear you talk, Socrates. So suddenly we have a different Thrasymakhos who wants to listen to Socrates and who doesn't sound sarcastic. The question is, what on earth happened between the end of book one and the beginning of book five, where Thrasymakhos didn't even talk at all? And then later on in book six, Socrates refers to Thrasymakhos saying that, yeah, he was very angry at me at the beginning, but now we have become friends. So a friendship is obviously a new relationship. It's a very, very, very, very important philosophical relationship. And now we are being told by Socrates that they are now friends with Thrasymakhos. I don't know when that thing happened. I missed something. Maybe they went outside to have a smoke, and then they just, as we do in Turkey, we just and then they came back. Maybe that's a possibility. But I don't know what happened that turned them into friends. And my question is a little bit that. What happened to Thrasymakhos in the meanwhile? So I'm wondering whether you can persuade and convince somebody, even if they're not listening. You see what I mean? He is sticking around. He didn't go to watch the festival. He didn't go to have a feast with others. He didn't go to talk to the young people that they were, promised at the beginning of book one. Remember, in book one, Adeimantus said, "Oh, we're going to go, have dinner, and then we're going to go to see the festival. We're going to see the horse race, and then we're going to talk with young boys and so on. Come on, Socrates." So it feels like they were very eager to watch these festivities, eat, and maybe have, sexual relationships. That's a possibility. But a lot of epithumia is going on there. There's a lot of promises to the appetites, it seems. But then it feels like Thrasymakhos maybe didn't feel like doing that. Why is he listening to this annoying person? And why is he not intervening while Glaucon and Adeimantus are taking up his position and they're defending it? And he's just like watching. That's not the kind of person he was in book one. He was a different kind of person. I don't know what happened. Did he take medicine, or I really don't know. But I have a guess. And I think this guess has to do with both the dogmatic aspect, and as you can see, I'm talking about a dramatic thing, but I'm also thinking about something dogmatic. I'm thinking about something conceptual at the same time. And I'm trying not to make things up. I'm trying to be textual as possible. Maybe I can slow down. I will point out to one or two other things, and then I'll just conclude or bring things together. But I'm fascinated with Thrasymakhos simply because he's from Kadıköy, which is already interesting. But historically, he's very weird. He's very interesting. The things that are said about him are very questionable. They're very weird. There are two things that are extremely weird, and that baffles the specialist, as far as I can tell. The first is that in the Byzantine encyclopedia called the Suda, that Erman would obviously know, there's an entry on Thrasymakhos, and in the entry on Thrasymakhos in the Suda, we are told that, where was that? I want to be precise about the quote. The Suda says about him that Thrasymakhos was a pupil of the philosopher Plato and of the rhetor Isocrates. So people in general obviously think that Plato and Thrasymakhos are antithetical. They're against one another. We have a very late, obviously, document saying that Thrasymakhos was a pupil of the philosopher Plato. But more importantly, there is a fragment of Thrasymakhos. This is from a commentary on Plato's Phaedrus by Hermias. This is in Dielskrantz B8 in the Laxmost. It's under Dean 17. This is the quote from Thrasymakhos. You know that Thrasymakhos in Book 1 says either that justice is just a matter of power, so might makes right, or the second point that he makes, maybe the same, maybe it's not, is that injustice is better than justice anyway. So he is really against this self-congratulatory discourse around justice being a virtue and so on. So he is a skeptic, or he is some more like a Foucauldian person who analyzes these superstructures in terms of power relationships. But we find a fragment by Thrasymakhos saying the following, I'm quoting, "The gods do not notice human affairs, for otherwise they would not have failed to take notice of what is the greatest good for humans, namely justice. For we see that humans do not practice this." This cannot be true. This cannot be right. There's got to be something going on here. So that adds to the mystery of this Thrasymakhos character, I think. And I think that, so I'll stop for 2 seconds, then I'll suggest an answer to what is going on. Why is he different from Book 1 all the way to Book 5? He's suddenly different. He's sticking around. Why is he doing that? Why do we have a fragment of him that goes against everything he says in the Republic? My answer will involve the dogmatic aspect of the Republic, especially the three-partite psychology. But let me stop here. Maybe I didn't talk too much about Book 1, but I'm sure your questions will open that up. Let me just have a sip of water and see your reactions before I enter into the answer.
Yes, any questions at this point? Buyurun, sorular.
Can I ask about, so you said a lot about these relationships. And one thing I thought was really interesting, I have no suggestions on this at all, but I think it's a good observation. So there is this common interpretation of the first line of the Republic that going down to the Piraeus is going down into the cave. Socrates is the philosopher going down to the ordinary people, which, you know, as you point out, he goes down with Glaucon, right? So that would suggest that Glaucon has also got the status of a philosopher, which sounds very unlikely. So why exactly is Glaucon with Socrates? So one question. I guess that's the question you raised. The other is that the brothers are separated, right? So you got Adimantus with one crowd, Glaucon with the other, which is not you'd expect them, I guess, to be together. So why are they separated? This is, I mean, just an observation. I don't have an answer, but you know, you made me think of this.
Well, to the second point you're making, we can think that naturally they're brothers. They happen to be in different parties, in different maybe gangs, but they will converge in book 2 for philosophical purposes. Now that's very telling. That's already, and this is actually pointing towards what I think might be a solution. They are being purified of their natural relationships, and they are being taken over by the friendship of philosophy or something like that. They are being taken over by the relationship of being the spectators of truth. You see what I mean? And that is roughly what will happen to Thrasymakhos too. And that is the reason why I think the dramatic aspect of the dialogue gets thinner and thinner and thinner as we go, because the dramatic variety of relationships are now boiling down towards a spectatorship of truth, or being engaged in the question, you know, what is justice and whether it's more profitable than injustice. They are wrapped up in the conceptual, in the search for truth, basically. And actually, I think that Thrasymakhos cannot leave because deep down inside, he's interested too. He wants to know what's going on. I mean, there should be a reason why he's hanging out. You always have these students who are super skeptical and they're like smartasses, but they just keep coming, you know, and then they say, you know, you can go. I won't write you down as not here, but you know, they would show up. Hey, selam Rafi. So Thrasymakhos is in a way like that. He cannot leave the conversation. There must be something compelling him to hang out. And I think that Thrasymakhos, unlike a character like Callicles, is super conflicted. He is a heartbroken lover of truth that turned misologist. You know the Socrates' description of misology in the Phaedo, but also in the Republic. He says that people come to hate logos for 2 different reasons. Either they don't know the taste of logos, so they find this philosophical discussion thing to be super weird in itself, and they just don't like it. That's one kind of misology. But there's another kind of misology, which is even worse, according to Socrates, and that is when a person has the taste of logos, has a taste of rational argument, and they love it. They love it so much that they put unrealistic expectations on logos and philosophy, and then they just see those expectations betrayed, and then they turn to the dark side or something like that. They end up hating logos, and they know what logos is like, and they are Bağrı, Yanık. I don't know how to say Bağrı, Yanık in English, but they're jilted, basically. They're jilted lovers. They feel like they're being betrayed. And that, I think, is behind Thrasymakhos' animosity, because I think in the past he believed in justice somehow. And this is what explains the little fragment where he says, justice is the best thing on earth. I'm surprised that gods do not care about it. So basically, if that is true, this is obviously a little bit speculation, but it does play into Plato's psychology, because at the beginning of book 2, what starts is, you know, the ideal city and the tripartite soul in book 4. And in the tripartite soul, we obviously have the epithumia, the thumoides, and the logistikon. And we are told that justice is the hierarchy, the proper hierarchy of the logistikon, the rational part, being on top of the spirited, and that being on top of the competitive, and so on. And I feel like what happened to Thrasymakhos between book 1 and book 5, and that transformed him just a little bit, was that he was confronted with his own psychology a little bit, in the sense that he was confronted with the epithumia, with his, for instance, maybe his desire for food, or desire for sex, or desire to some appetitive desires he was confronted with. But more importantly, he was confronted with the thymoeidetic, that is the spirited aspect of his soul, which is very dominant, obviously. He wanted to win. He wanted to, be more powerful. He wanted to take over the scene from Socrates. And he is now listening to an account of psychology where his own almost psychotherapy is just starting. He said, these are the layers that we have in our psychology. And then there's also the rational part. And, so as Socrates is talking about the human soul, it might be the case that Thrasymakhos is just listening and he's eavesdropping exactly the way kids eavesdrop their parents, They're not looking at that direction, but they're listening to them. I don't know that's called lateral listening or something like that. But that's what it feels like. He is listening to Socrates. He cannot stop doing that. And he doesn't agree, he doesn't disagree, but he's there. He's just silently listening. And he's calmer. In book 5, he's calmer. He's almost friendly. So much so that he wants Socrates to keep on going. What happened, really? I think that there was a little bit of a psychotherapeutic thing going on there. I'm not saying that he was cured from his mythology. I'm not saying that the dramatic level of the Republic is an education in itself. Education is not that easy. I don't think that Glaucon became a philosopher. I don't think that Adeimantus was cured of all his he didn't become a philosopher king. But it is the case that they changed a little bit. Their idiosyncratic relationships are now purified and taken into account with book 4 and book 5 and so on. And with book 6, they are recognizing that we are the lovers of truth. We are the lovers of the sight of truth, rather than the lovers of the sight of a horse race or, beautiful food and beautiful boys or girls or whatever. Socrates is saying that, look what happened. We changed. We changed our focus. And everybody's like, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. So I just find this dynamic, even in classes that I give every now and then, you would have these, bitter people who would just want to stay around. I find that to be a case of mythology. And I find the Socratic irony and the Socratic dogmatic stance of talking about impersonal things, so to speak, a great way for people to tap into these ideas and think about their personal issues. And so that's roughly my question. And do I have anything else to say? Yeah, my conclusion is then that one can speak in a persuasive, if not transformative way, and a captivating way, even if it's not an educative way, even to a non-listener, by turning him obliquely toward the various pre-reflective discourses that he is listening to instead. Because even if we're not listening to one discourse, we're more often than not listening to another discourse, and that is how we can shut off one discourse. In the sense that just like Cephalus turns off Socrates' logos, but that's because he is listening to other logoi in his own mind, in his subconscious or something like that. The same thing is happening, I think, with Thrasymakhos. So that's basically what I have. I didn't talk too much about the arguments in book 1, but hopefully this will give you some kind of a sweep from the first book into the middle books through the psychology. And it might give you an idea about Plato's studies today. Thanks a lot for listening. This is the material that I had. So now I should do this.
Thank you so much, Umar. I think that's a great introduction to the seminar. I mean, it's a wonderful framework for people as they go on and read the Republic and attend these monthly meetings. This questioning of the relationship between the dogmatic and the dramatic elements and how it plays out is a way in, for people, a way into the book, to the whole work. I think it's wonderful. It was beautifully clear. Thank you so much, Amar.
Thank you, Victoria.
Now, I have questions, and I'm sure everybody has questions, but let's take a very short break. Okay, maybe you want to get a cup of coffee or something. We will come back at 10 minutes after 20 o'clock. Yani 8-10 geçede buradayız. Okay?
Great. Damien, I didn't answer your question. I will touch.
Go ahead, do that. Or you
no, the first one I forgot. Let's do it after the break.
Yeah, we'll do it after. Good.
We'll do it after the break.
Welcome, Myrta. Myrta Bartel.
Hi, thank you.
I'm so glad you could make it. Our speaker just finished talking.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm a bit late. I had another meeting.
Oh, well, I'm so glad you could make it. I'm very flattered. Yes, he focused on dogmatic as opposed to dramatic elements. And he's particularly interested in Thrasymakhos, how he begins as a very even violently opposed, and yet sticks around for books, many books into the Republic. What is that all about? He was talking about that. How are you doing? Your thing is turned off.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
We're on our break.
Oh, right. I see.
That's why everybody's not here. They're coming back in 6 minutes.
Oh, right. I see. I'm good. I just moved from Pisa to Budapest, in fact.
Hi, Mirte.
Hi, Erman. How are you doing?
Hi, how are you? It's been such a long time.
Yeah, sorry. So you were there, actually. You were not having your break.
No, I was here. How are you?
Yeah, good. Good to see you. How are you doing?
And good to see you too. Good to see you too. Go ahead, please. You were having a conversation, so just go ahead.
Tell us about Budapest. How is it?
Well, I've just arrived, so I can't tell you that much about it yet. We had some introductory activities, like on the first 3 days, basically. So this was the first day that I could actually go, walk around a bit, have lunch somewhere, look at where the supermarket is, all that kind of basic stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've never been there. I had a Hungarian lover, though.
Do you have good memories?
Yes, he was a really good guy, and he was a philosopher. He was a painter. This is back in the late 1970s. He was very sweet, very kind, very intelligent, good painter, abstract expressionist painter. He told me all these stories. He was, like 12 years old when the Soviets invaded.
Yeah. Okay.
He was an orphan, and he was in an orphanage. And they had discovered that he had a talent for painting, and so they gave him a training in painting. And but he said that, he was very shy, and he was starving, and he was very skinny. He was a tall guy, but he was very skinny. And he said there was this Russian class everybody had to take, and everybody hated Russians, and nobody wanted to learn Russian, but he never said anything until one day he just found himself standing up and saying, "I'm not going to learn Russian, and nobody here is going to learn Russian either." And then they heard this noise outside, and everybody ran to the windows, and it was like the tanks were rolling down the street, So he just happened to have this, feeling of rebellion on the day that the Soviets invaded.
Right.
Yeah. It's like
a story.
Spirit, that overcomes people in a situation like that, where it all becomes too much. And even the little guy, the 12-year-old skinny guy who can't get enough to eat, stands up and says,
Yeah. So how did you meet him?
He became a refugee, and he grew up across the street from one of my best friends.
Okay. But in Turkey?
No. This was a friend of mine. I used to be a singer for years. I made my living as a jazz singer. And Joel, this friend of mine, was a piano player. We worked together for 10 years. And this old childhood friend came to visit him in New York, in Soho. I'm from New York. And I met him there.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So they had grown up together, but Zoli, his name was Zoltan, used to call him Zoli. He had moved away, and and so he ended up shooting himself in the head.
Oh. I came back at an interesting conversation.
I imagine if you just entered the room.
Oh, we were talking about food just a moment ago.
Yeah, so we have one more minute to wait. Marta has joined us, Ömer.
Yeah, and apologies to everyone for being late.
Hi, welcome,
at
Marta.
another meeting.
Nali is here also. I think you know each other.
Yes, we met in Assos.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful Assos. I stayed there for 40 days this summer. It just happened to be 40 days. So they didn't have a room any longer than that, or I would have stayed all summer. I was writing a book, and it was perfect way to retreat and just sit there by the water. And, yeah.
But was there also the summer school or the conference?
The conference, yeah, that lasts 2 days, so 3 days.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Every year I go there, I go, and then I come home, and then I say, why did I come home? Why didn't I stay there? It was great. It was great to stay there. Okay, we're back, and this is a very free conversational group, Marta. Even while speakers are speaking, everybody is free to say, wait a minute, I didn't get it, So we have open conversation now. Everybody's free to speak. Nali is a professor from Tel Aviv, is very well known specialist in Plato. And he's going to speak for us on book 5 later, as is Refik. Both of them are going to have separate meetings on Refik. I mean, on book 5. Right, Nali? Okay. We'll be talking about
that was a yes.
So, questions, comments, contributions?
Belki ben sorabilirim hocam. Eğer tabii ben Türkçe soracağım. Belki isterseniz İngilizce'ye çevirebilirsiniz sorumu daha sonra. Ömer hocam, ben elbette bunun çevirisini Türkçeden okudum. Devleti. Sabahattin Eyüboğlu, Mehmet Ali Cimcos çevirisinden okudum. Bunu Victoria Hoca'ya da sormuştum geçen hafta. Ama siz kitabı bugünlere çevirdiğinizi söylüyorsunuz ya. Şimdi baktığımız zaman justice'in karşılığı olarak özellikle doğruluk kelimesini seçtiklerini söylüyorlar mütercimler. Doğru ve doğruluğu tercih ediyorlar. Benim 2 sorum olacak. Bir, siz de düşünüyorsunuz bu konuda. Yani justice'in karşılığı olarak doğruluk iyi bir tercih mi? Siz hangi kelimeyi tercih edeceksiniz veya ettiniz? Herhalde o bölümü çevirmişsinizdir. Hangi kelimeyi kullandınız hocam?
Tamam, İngilizceye çok kısaca çevireyim isterseniz. Soruyu en azından bağlama bilsinler. The question is about how I translated the word dikayosune into Turkish, because we've been using the Arabic word adalet, but there are older translations that used another word, which is doğruluk. And Mücahit asked me which one I would be choosing and why. I will answer in Turkish, and then I'll do an English shorter version, because this is about Turkish words. It's pretty specific. Adalet diye çevirmenin de, doğruluk diye çevirmenin de avantajları, dezavantajları var. Hiçbir zaman üst üste 3 kere düşeş atılmıyor. Çok karışık metinler bunlar ve çok kişiye birden sürekli borç ödemek zorundasınız. Sürekli kapınızı birisi çalıyor, camdan giriyor, bir tarafta pencereden dalıyor. Yani çevirmenin bu karışıkta metinlerle cebelleşmesini kolaylaştırmamız lazım bence. Benim şeyim şu oldu. Şimdi Sabahattin Eyüboğlu'nun ön sözünde doğruluk karşılığı için gerekçesi hoş. Ve doğruluğu iyi kullanıyorlar. Ama o buluş Sabahattin Eyüboğlu ve Mehmet Ali Cimdoz'un değil, daha önce 40'larda Rode'nin gözetimindeki muhteşem çeviri. Türkçenin yapması gereken şey çok basitti arkadaşlar. Rode'nin çevirisini alacaktı. İlk 4 kitabı yapmışlar. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 yapacaklardı. Bitecekti bu iş. Biz de rahat edecektik. Onlar doğruluk diye çevirdi. Denediler onu, bayağı da iyi yürüttüler. Doğrulukun avantajlı yerleri vardır. Mesela Eyüp'ün kitabını okuduğunuzda eski ahitte bazı çevirilerde şöyle geçer. İşte Eyüp Tanrı'ya çok inanan bir adamdı, doğru adamdı falan filan. Yani doğru adam şey anlamında doğru adam değil. Yani biz sol bek arıyoruz, doğru adamı bulduk değil de doğru dürüst bir adamdı ve doğru adamdı. Şimdi biz adil adamdı deyince bir dezavantaj oluyor. Maalesef Türkçe'de adil sözcüğü benden yüksek olana karşı adil olamam. Türkçe'de tuhaf kaçıyor. İnsan kendinden aşağı olan, yani bir kral adil davranabilir tebaasına. Tebaanın vergisini vermesi adil değildir. Yani yapması gerekeni yapıyor. Anlatabiliyor muyum? Türkçe'de adalet deyince mesela ben arkadaşıma da adil davranmak birazcık tuhaf kaçar. Ben arkadaşıma desem ki ben sana çok adil davrandım desem, derse ne kadar şey bir laf bu, ne kadar abartılı bir laf bu. Adalet sözcüğü yukarıdan aşağıya, yani adil davranan tarafın adil davranılan tarafa üstün olduğu varsayımı Türkçe'de var gibi duruyor. Mesela Osmanlı'ya baktığınızda işte daire-i adalet falan filan dediğinizde de gene devletle bağdaştırılıyor hep adalet. Yani yurttaşın adil davranması diye bir şey söz edilmiyor. Oysa dikayosune böyle olmak zorunda değil. Nitekim iki arkadaş arasında sen bana haksızlık ettin ya da sen çok haklı davrandın ya da hakkı gözettin. Sen kadir şinas davrandığına kadar bile gidebilecek bir anlamı var. Dolayısıyla adaletin yürümediği yerler oluyor. Adaletin dezavantajlı olduğu bağlamlar yok değil. Doğruluğun iyi gittiği bazı bağlamlar var. Doğruluğun dezavantajı, gene Sabahattin Eyüboğlu'nun ön sözünde söylediği gibi, biz ortos için de doğru diyoruz. Yani correct ya da right ya da işte true için de bazen doğru diyoruz. Yani doğru bir önerme, yanlış bir önerme. Doğruyu söyle, yanlışı söyle. Şimdi bu epistemolojik tartışmayla etik tartışmayı iç içe sokacak doğruluk dediğimizde. Bunu Sabahattin Eyüboğlu sanki bir avantajmış gibi şöyle söylüyor. Türkçe'de hem correctness anlamındaki sözcüğe doğruluk hem de justice anlamındaki sözcüğe doğruluk denmesi de boşuna olmasa gerek diye 3 noktayla bitiriyor paragrafı. Tamam da felsefe terminolojisinde doğruluk sözcüğüne çok yük binmiş oluyor. Anlatabiliyor muyum? O da doğru, bu da doğru. Doğrunun bir tersi yanlış, doğrunun bir tersi yalan, doğrunun bir tersi eğri. Şimdi anladım da yani doğruya çok fazla yük bindirmiş olmuyor muyuz? Doğrunun tersi yani adikia içinde eğrilik diyorlar. O da çok güzel oluyor namussuz. Ama dediğim gibi çok ağırlık biniyor o doğruluk sözcüğü. Adaletin avantajı var. Dezavantajından bahsettim. Büyük ölçüde yukarıdan aşağıya bir hiyerarşi farkı varsaydırıyor. Mesela bir çocuk annesine adil olabilir mi? Bilmiyorum. Bir kul Tanrı'ya adil olabilir mi? Onu adalet dağıttığını düşündürür bu ve olmaz yani. Yani doğru bir laf gibi gelmiyor benim kulağıma. Baktığım zaman kaynaklarda adalet hakikaten yukarıdan aşağı. Yani kral tebaaya, tanrı kula, işte vesaire vesaire. Avantajı adaletin tabii çok köklü bir sözcük. Yani artık bu kadar olur yani. Yani adaletin çok çekici tarafları var. Yani bütün işte Osmanlı'daki, Arapçadaki bagajı çok hoş bir bagaj. Ve adaleti biraz da rehabilite etmek lazım bugün Türkçe'de sözcük olarak. Yani içi boşaltıldı. Sanki adalet deyince aklımıza ilk gelen şey adalet sarayı oluyor. Yani benim aklıma Çağlayan falan geliyor yani, ama bizim bunu rehabilite etmemiz lazım belki. Ben bu rehabilitasyonun bir parçası olarak da adalet sözcüğünü tercih edeceğim gibi gözüküyor. Kadir bilirlik, hakseverlik, hak gözetirlik, hak bilirlik diyenler var. Haksızlık çok güzel oluyor. Ama haksızlığın tersi haklılık değil aslında. Yani sen bana haksızlık ettin, haksızlık yapmasaydın sen bana haklılık ettin demeyiz. Orada da oyunlar var. Uzun lafın kısası hiçbir zaman 3 kere üst üste düşeş atamıyorsunuz. Ve 3 kere üst üste düşeş atacakmışçasına da yargılamamak gerekir çevirmenleri. Çevirmenleri biraz şey bırakmak lazım. Biraz bu kadar sözcük çalıştığımızda çeviriler çirkin oluyor her şeyden önce ve çok da doğru olmuyor her zaman. Yani bu kadar birebir çalıştığımızda sonuç olarak metni çevirmek yalnızca sözcükleri çevirmek demek değil. Dolayısıyla ben evet adalet dedim, büyük ölçüde de oradan yürüdüm. Yani sıklıkla değil, bazen kötü oldu. Ama biraz onu göze aldım. Şimdilik onu yapacağım. Şu da önemli, adalet diye kavradıktan sonra diğer erdemleri de biraz onunla uyumlu bir şekilde çevirmek gerekebiliyor. Hadi bu sefer dedim, ya soprosyniye itidal mı diyeceğim, zart zurt yani çok zor bir metin. Her açıdan çok zor. Benim dediğim hep şey şu, çevirmenlerin ellerini arkadan bağlamayalım. Yani bayağı ciddi bir eskrim var burada. Çevirmenlerin elleri olabildiğince serbest olmalı. Çünkü çok zor iş yapılıyor. Yani zor bir iş yapılmaya çalışılıyor. Hem felsefi tutarlılık, hem argüman takibi, hem üslup, hem okunurluk. Bulması çok güzel, edebi bir metin şimdi. Sen onu tabii ki o kadar güzel çeviremeyeceksin ama bir sorumluluk da orada var falan. Çok zor iş. O yüzden de ben adalet dedim geçtim. Buyurun.
Şeyi merak ediyorum. Mesela yeri geldiğinde adalet, yeri geldiğinde doğruluk yapılamaz mı çeviride?
Olabilir.
Yani dediniz ya tam
o zaman da
uydukları
şöyle
yerler
olacak.
var.
Olabilir. Bazı durumlarda, bazı çok önemli terimlerde öyle yaptığım oldu. Ama doğrulukta da şöyle bir durum var. Hem ortos hem aletes için doğru kullanılabiliyor. Dolayısıyla bu doğru sözcüğüne binen ağırlık çok fazla. Yani aletes'in karşılığı olabiliyor. Bazen mesela diyor ki Sokrates'e, çok doğru söyledin ya da en doğru sen söylüyorsun falan diyor. Aletes de falan diyor mesela. Şimdi sen aletes'e de doğru diyeceksen bu sefer her yerde doğruyu kullanmış oluyorsun. O da bir yol. O da iyi bir yol değil ve zaten üslup olarak da bayağı çirkin olmaya başlayabiliyor. Dolayısıyla benim birazcık hissiyatım şu. Eskiden internet yoktu. İnternet olmadan önce insanlar eski Yunanca metne erişimde çok daha fazla zorlanıyorlar. Alacaksın da işte o senin elinde olacak da açacaksın da bakacaksın da. Bugün 2 dakika içinde Perseus'tan eski Yunanca sözcüklere bakılabiliyorsa eski Yunanca sözcüklere bakılamamasının getirdiği dezavantajlardan artık kurtulalım ve bakmak mı istiyorsunuz Yunanca'ya? Buyurun açın bakın artık herkes kullanabiliyor. Bu şey değil. Gizli bir şey değil yani Yunanca metin. Zor erişilecek zor bir şey de değil. Üstelik yani o sözcük acaba bu sözcük mü şu sözcük mü? Tamam bunu sorgulamanız çok güzel ama internetten açıp bakabiliyorsunuz. Çok kolay bir şey. Eskiden böyle değildi. Yani eskiden daha harfi olmak için bir sebebimiz vardı. Çünkü eski Yunanca metnine erişim bu kadar kolay değil. Benzer şekilde bugün çift dilli baskılar çok güzel, çok hoşuma gidiyor. Ama internet öncesinde çift dilli baskılar daha da değerliydi. Çünkü ulaşılamıyor. Tek ulaşabileceğin şey o elindeki işte çift dilli baskı oluyordu. Zor bir mesele. Çok çok katmanlı bir mesele. Kısaca İngilizce'de söyleyeyim. In short, my answer was I preferred the Arabic word adalet for translating dikaios süne. But it's really just like justice in English. You know, many people think that it should be other stuff like what is that? What is moral? There are different translations of the word dikaios in very recent translations of the Republic. So the same situation is in Turkish as well. And you can never really hit the mark on all. You make some people unhappy. Some people are going to be unhappy with the translation. What I think a translator should do is to be clear about what he wants to do with the translation. Do you want it to be used in high schools, or do you want it to be used by scholars, or do you want it to? You cannot really do both. If you try to make everybody happy, chances are you're going to make nobody's going to be happy, and you're not going to be happy either. So I use adalet it has its own disadvantages, but I think the advantages trump the disadvantages. And the advantages usually come from the fact that it's a very old word. It's very grained into the legal, philosophical, religious discourse. And the connotations are interesting and important, and they're relevant to the Platonic project. So, but it's a tricky question. All these punctual questions of terminology, they can be pretty misleading because the text is more than just a collection of specific words. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, more questions, please.
Damien, I think I missed your first one, but I forgot what your first one was.
I mean, I guess I felt there were kind of connected questions. One was that there's this common reading of the opening line of the Republic, and even the opening passage that it's reference to the cave that will come later, and Socrates is going down into the cave, which kind of implies that he's left the cave and has knowledge and the like. But as you point out, he goes down with Glaucon, which seems to put Glaucon on the same, if it is a mark of his epistemic status, seems to put Glaucon on the same level. Yeah. But typically people will see Glaucon as, certainly at a lower epistemic level, some kind of, person who has enlightened belief or something. And then similarly, Glaucon and Adeimantus are separated in these groups. Is that a ranking between them? Yeah, so I guess it's the weird placing of Glaucon. That's the question.
Well, the reason why I wanted to use the unit of relationships is because when you get into these specific characters, the discourse gets really undecidable. So Glaucon, who's Glaucon? What kind of person he is? Some people say that he's sort of a little bit dim-witted, he's a little bit stupid. Some say he's very brave. But that's just so particular and so idiosyncratic that I have a hard time following what's going on. So what I do, I try to avoid that over-particularity by saying that, well, let's not focus so much on, let's say, Cephalus being rich. Everybody talks about that. It is significant to some degree. Him coming from here or there, or Thrasymakhos, as a particular person is not that, or Thrasymakhos, maybe that's not a good, or Polemarchus. I think he's not interesting as a person, but he is interesting as taking part of a relationship. So Glaucon and Adeimantus, I don't think they're that interesting as characters, as characters in a novel or something. I wouldn't be too interested in reading them. But I am interested in their relationship, in the brotherhood, the idea of a natural relationship and a rivalry, but then the cooperation that they have, that they overcome maybe the rivalry somehow. And now they inherit not their father's money, like Cephalus, hands it over to Polemarchus. They take over the argument of Thrasymakhos, somebody they just disagree with. And they are taking that relationship and they are sublating it, so to speak. They are making it more general, more universal, more philosophical. And that is indicative of where the book is going. It starts with particular people doing particular things, and slowly it calms down into more monotonous, more conceptual, drier pursuit of truth or something like that.
And how about this as let's say, I agree with you, Glaucon, Adeimantus as the heroes in various novels. I might not read it, but they exemplify a character type, right? And a very specific character type that might be important to Plato, right?
I'm a little bit skeptical about that.
Oh, really? It is interesting that they grow up in a city where there's a lot of injustice, and they turn out to have a genuine love for justice, even though they don't have a kind of rational justification for it. they still have this love for justice, which doesn't seem to be common with the other characters.
That's right. That's right. So that would be because they are from Athens, or that would be because they are Plato's brothers. That would be because they.
But is it also why they're the interlocutors in the dialogue, for example?
That's true. That's true. But is that because they are from Athens? I'm not sure Plato would be, you know.
I think Plato's answer, at least I'm not entirely sure, but he hints every now and then, but that some people can be good people just out of a kind of moral look. He calls it divine look. So even if you grow up in a bad city, and I think you would think Athens is a pretty corrupting city, you can, out of pure moral look, be a good person. And they seem to exemplify this kind of unusual character type.
That's true. That's true.
Maybe we want to go further. We want to match it up with certain character types who might be, or compare it with certain character types that we find later in the dialogue, like the decent person in book 10, or, but yeah, I think it's at least interesting that
that's true.
Less specifically about them, but more about the kind of people that they.
Yeah. One thing that I don't like is to say that Cephalus is just the rich guy. So he represents, I don't know, the wealthy, blah, blah, blah. Or you can also say Cephalus represents the religious, backwards, so you can call him, and I don't like that. I don't see Cephalus as that much of a universal, symbol of a concept. And I don't like to think of him as just this narrow, specific person. That's why I said, well, how about I think of Cephalus as a father? And he situates himself as a son and a grandson. And he says, well, my grandfather had a lot of money, and then my father screwed it up. And I have more than my father, and I would be happy if I hand over my sons more than I inherited. So he is putting himself in these economical relationships. He's really drawing a chart of sorts, an economic chart. And I think that approach could be more fruitful than just looking where he was born, or looking, he was sitting on this weird chair, or he was putting on this hat. I mean, I read so much about these things.
What about, again, his character type? He's a very specific character type. He's got a very particular relationship with his desires. He doesn't like his lower desires. They bother him. And he's glad he's old, so he doesn't have to bother his desires anymore. He's glad he has money, because it means that, so he exemplifies a kind of character type again. Yeah.
That's true. But then people say, oh, his name is Cephalus, so that's got to do with something with the head, or I just find this to be over particularization. I'm not against these. But if we go more in this direction, then you start dreaming about, your own character, and I start dreaming about my own character, and I don't know how we would match them. That's just the danger of being over particular about the dramatic elements. That's what I'm saying.
I agree, because it gets very speculative there. But it's not as if the dialogue isn't concerned about the appetites and the role they play in the good life and so forth. It's super sensual stuff, and he's giving a sort of the dialogue is going to give an account of what you should do with these bothersome appetites. He's giving his own account of what he thinks is a good thing. Just wait till you're old. Make sure you have enough money to deal with them, and Yeah,
and I already said that at the opening. The whole interaction with Polemarchus, that is proleptic. I'm fine with prolepsis. That's I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem when it gets to, you're saying something like. Polemarchus, well, it's got to do something with war. So we expect him to be always a warlike person, which he sort of is, but it's weak. Plato is such a great writer that these little squiggly connections, we should look at more meaty stuff, which is what I tried to do with Thrasymakhos, saying that, well, look, Thrasymakhos is complex. We have different layers. We see the mythology in him, but he's different from Callicles. So I am fine with doing a psychotherapy of the characters, but I do not do it because his name is that way, or he was born in Calculum. But even him being born in Calculum might be significant, because Calculum was being invaded by the Athens, and maybe he was part of a diplomatic a team that was being sent to Athens and so on. So maybe I'm just being too rambly. Neely Taylor, please.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about something that you said regarding your analysis of Thrasymakhos' character. So you said that you think he's somebody who cared very much for justice, at least initially. But in the context of the Republic, this can mean quite a few different things, because Kephalos cares about justice in his own way, and even the people who Glaucon represents in his challenge care quite a lot about justice. They think that it's an amazing gift. They seem to hold something like the position of Protagoras in the Protagoras, where he says, you know, it's essential for human beings if they want to live in communities, and of course, if they don't live in communities, they're going to die. So even somebody like who is represented by the challenge really cares about justice. And then there's the way that Glaucon and Adamentos care about justice, which is, like Damien said, they have this intuition that it's something even more exalted than that it's not, that its essence has to do with something that's over and above its benefits to the maintaining of your material and bodily needs. So when you say that you think Thrasymakhos initially cared about justice, so what kind of caring is that? And I want to connect this to maybe a suggestion. You make Thrasymakhos out to be a mythologist, but it seems that there's a closer in the sense that it's in the Republic rather than in the Phaedo way to analyze what happened to him, because in Book 7 we are told that people who engage in dialectic without mathematical education start looking down on the laws that they were raised by. So it can be that Thrasymakhos started out as a moral realist, assuming that his position is some version of the nomos physis distinction, and that he's some kind of moral relativist. He may have started out as a moral realist, but one who's merely a realist in the sense that he believed that the laws he was brought up in were good. I mean, they represent justice. But when he was exposed to dialectic, he saw that, there are various ways to show that, well, what's just for the Athenians is unjust for the Spartans, and so on and so on. And then he became not so much a mythologist, but somebody who looks down, who became a moral relativist, as a result of his dabbling in dialectic without having the proper sort of mathematical education, which shows you exactly how to deal with these with this transcending of the appearances. So my suggestion is maybe that you may want to pinpoint the sort of caring that Thrasymakhos had for justice and connect that to the dangers that are discussed in Book 7 about engaging in dialectic. And we know from the Phaedrus that Thrasymakhos is somebody who cared a lot about convincing in law courts, etc., etc. So this might be some sort of a downfall of doing that, having that kind of practice in contrary arguments without having a mathematical education.
So with regard to your first point, Thrasymakhos is caring about justice, that I should qualify it. And you said that many characters care about justice. So that's true. What is interesting about Thrasymakhos is that in Book 1, there are parts of Book 1 where he says injustice is clearly more powerful than justice. So philosophically, in Book 1, he's saying that justice is just Socrates congratulating himself about being virtuous, but it's basically just a mask. So unlike the other characters, we find Thrasymakhos not care about justice in Book 1, which makes his caring about justice in the little fragment more interesting. I don't know what that caring is about because we just have the fragment, but it looks like, my suggestion is that the way he argues for injustice in Book 1 is so vehement and so bodily, and so he's sweating, he's attacking. All this animosity is symptomatic of something more than just thinking that injustice is better than justice. It feels like he thought of the opposite. So I don't know exactly what kind of caring that was, what kind of concept of justice he had, but it feels like he changed his position, and that is why he looks like a mythologist, because the mythologist comes from the fact that he was in love with Logos, but the love was just for an idealized version of rationality, which didn't live up to the expectations, which then ended up.
But why do you identify a love of justice with a love of Logos? I mean, why does that have to follow?
Well, I mean, what I think is going on is it's a similar mechanism. There's a high expectation which was not fulfilled, and then you have reactionariness. So I'm not saying necessarily that Thrasymakhos is a mythologist, but he's a reactionary in precisely the way mythologist, the second kind of mythologist is, because they just react to having believed in one concept or a person. So in the Phaedo, Socrates says, they're like misanthropists who trust people, and then they are betrayed over and over again, and they end up hating everybody and so on. So that reactionariness I find in Thrasymakhos. And for instance, I don't find it in Callicles, and I don't find it in any of the other characters. So him praising injustice is not simply a praise of injustice. It's also a little revenge that he's taking on his prior expectations from the concept of justice. With regard to the relativism, the second point that you're making, well, couldn't he be like in book 7, he would be a relativist who didn't get the proper mathematical education, therefore he's just left with his powers of dialectic gone astray. I think there's more than that, because he's not simply a relativist, he is angry. He has an animosity. And I'm trying to explain that. He's not saying that, he's not simply saying that everything is relative. He's not simply being a virtuoso of language or of argument. He basically hates Socrates for a while. And I'm trying to understand the energy behind him, and the energy Plato does put on stage very, very pointedly. That's why I wouldn't say it's enough to say that he's just a moral relativist.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that this could be a further backing for your.
Yeah.
Because he's somebody who was very attached to justice at first.
That's right.
Then started dabbling in dialectic or contrary arguments, and then discovered he was disillusioned about justice precisely because he was able to. This is what I mean, that the book 7 passage allows you to explain exactly why he's so vehement, why he's so frustrated with people who try to show that justice is a genuinely good thing, because he's saying, well, look, I was just like you, but I discovered this is all a sham. And this is something that's being attributed to the people who start dealing in dialectic in book 7 without the mathematical education. So this is what I was trying to say, that this gives you, this supports your view.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's a great point, and I didn't make that connection. That's great. That's very, very helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
Rafik?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Ömer, I'm sorry I missed a great part of your talk, but I regret this because I now realize how much I miss listening to you. Actually, I was going to ask about the same thing. I was going to ask for a clarification about Thrasymakhos caring about justice, because I think I've always felt the same way about Thrasymakhos. He always kind of sounded expressing some kind of a complaint or being ironic about his definition of justice. I always ask myself whether Thrasymakhos was really serious about his definition of justice. So I have my answer now. Thank you very much. But as I'm talking, maybe I can ask a question nonetheless. So what will this give us about Callicles, for instance, because he is also another vehement figure in dialogues. So and he's the real mythologist after all. What will this give us as a comparison between Thrasymakhos and Callicles.
Some people here would know much better than I do, but I think it's in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There's a very good comparison of the two. Who wrote it? It's got to be Rachel Barney, I think. But that's a place to look at. The way I see it is, I find Callicles to be cooler, colder, more draconian, more thick-skinned, I would say, and more cruel, I would say, somehow, than Thrasymachos. Thrasymachos is childish. He is like a teenager. He's very reactionary. He's very thin-skinned. And that thin skin is something that precisely Plato, in his dramatic aspect, he puts it on stage. He says, I'm Thrasymakhos, I'm putting this character, and he's going to sweat. I'm going to just focus on, I'm going to zoom in on, the sweat on his forehead or something like that. And he does that again and again. And I'm trying to think what is boiling inside this guy's mind. And obviously, I take Plato to be a very good psychologist. And so in Callicles, I don't see the boiling. Maybe he's keeping it cooler. And Callicles is more, I would say, he's more consistent, because he says, well, it's pretty much about power. This philosophy thing, it's good when you do it when you're young. But when you do it as an old man, you're just a weirdo, and people should beat you up, but I don't care too much. He's not affected personally, he's not implicated personally by the discussion, whereas it feels like Thrasymachos just cannot distance himself from the issue. You see what I mean? But this is, I have to go back and work through the Gorgias to back that up more clearly. But as I said, you can very easily find something online that's very, very good. It's more elaborate than what I just spurred it out.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Victoria, can I ask a question?
Please.
So actually, I would like to zoom out a little bit to where we started. This tension between the dramatic and the dogmatic aspects in Plato. Because I was initially very sympathetic to your point. Actually, I still am. I'm not a philosopher myself, and I'm not a specialist in Plato by any means. But my first course in grad school happened to be on Plato, and actually it killed all my love for Plato just by, reading Plato to the letter without any consideration of his more literary aspects of his text. And as a literary scholar, I am particularly interested in that aspect. And my background is in German Romanticism, and the German Romantics were the first translators of Plato from Greek to German. Plato is all over the place there. And they focused a lot on the interaction between the kind of theatrical aspects of his text and the more philosophical aspects of his text. And I just was wondering, and this is kind of the romantic reading of Plato, to what extent we can consider the dramatic aspect as a philosophical method in itself. So what I mean by that is that for Romanticism, philosophy cannot be reduced to a first principle. Philosophy should be open-ended. And they find all these principles precisely in Plato's dialogues. So, like I said, as a non-Plato scholar, I would be interested to hear your response to that approach to Plato, and whether it might be beneficial to bring those two aspects together again.
Thank you, but I'm not a specialist of German Romanticism, so I cannot answer it. But I can refer you to Tigerstedt's works. It's the Tiger, like Tigerstedt. His book on the Neoplatonic reading of Plato and its decline, or something like that. He goes through much of the history of the reception of Plato. And he does talk a lot about German Romanticists that ended with Schleiermacher's position. And Schleiermacher's position, which I find very, very close to mine, is about integrating the content and the form. So the content being the dogmatic stuff and the form being the literary or the dramatic stuff. And there it feels like the romantic sort of fusion seems to be there. The idea that the body and the soul are one and the form and the content are one. And Plato is just a master of doing this. So I would suggest looking at Tigerstedt's stuff on German Romantic reception of Plato, and then look at Schleiermacher's introductions to Plato's dialogues are super nice, super. It's very, very good. I think it's pretentious for me to say this a little bit, but I think he understands Plato better than anybody else, pretty much. He's very, very sympathetic to the form and the matter, and he gives a great account of the problem. People after Schleiermacher criticized him because there were contradictions in the corpus, and people said, well, how do we deal with these contradictions? Schleiermacher was very, very smart, and I think he correctly saw that the contradictions came from the fact that the dialogues are like an educational agenda. They're like an educational program of sorts. And it really does depend on the level of the dialogue that we're talking about. All is part of the education, but there are different levels. And I sort of agree with that. I think that is the case. I think, and so we do not have to fall into developmentalism in order to account for the contradictions. Yeah, all skeptical readings of Plato, starting with the New Academy with Arcesilaus, but then later on with the Romantics. And also in the 20th century, there was a lot of skeptic readings of Plato. Skeptic reading meaning Plato's dialogues we do not have arguments that are supposed to settle philosophical issues. That's not what the dialogues are for. The dialogues are open-ended, as you were saying. They were more, improvisations and just probative. They're just probes into philosophical issues. That was also prevalent in the 20th century as well. I was raised by some of them, by some of the skeptic readers of Plato.
Were you talking about Alexander Traeger?
No, who is that? Alexander?
German Romanticism and Plato. The reception.
I was talking about him. No.
Which Traeger? Alexander Traeger?
No. Tigerstedts. This is a contemporary guy who has a book on the reception of Plato, which I really like. His name is Tigerstedts. Tigersteddt. And there's Francisco Gonzalez from Ottawa. I like him a lot. He's a very young Platonist. I really like it. His general strategy, I think, is spot on. How to deal with the dramatic and the dogmatic aspects of the corpus. I think they do a very good job of doing justice to both aspects of the corpus, because these aspects are constants. They're not just like one dialogue and then they're lost. They come over and over again, and so we have to account for both. We have to respect both. But it feels like I got onto a tangent with regard to your question. So do you have a follow-up, or I'm sorry if I rambled too much?
Well, I was just, because if I understand you correctly, you fall back, that's not the right word, but you explain the dramatic aspects through psychologization, right?
A little bit, that's what I did today, yeah.
Yeah, so, I was just wondering to what extent we could, you answered that question, to what extent we could just be like, leave like the kind of the different positions and the contradictions in the text recognize them and appreciate them without this ambition to, without falling into skepticism and a kind of like anything goes, but as part of yeah, how to say that, as a recognition, and that is what, you know, like what I see, I think also Schleiermacher do, although I'm not familiar with those texts, but you know, look at knowing Schleiermacher's text and you know where he comes from, I would say that it would be a celebration of like a particular kind of philosophy that is not seeking resolution per se, but is just celebrating its open-ended character.
You're very close to the skeptic reading. I am sort of close. I was close to it for quite a while. But I'm not that skeptic anymore. I fell back into the dogmatic reading pretty much. I think that the dramatic elements are there. They should be respected. They shouldn't be, and I use them, but at the end of the day, it is still the conceptual content that brings us together and that makes us evaluate which dramatic elements to use, which dramatic elements to interpret. And so even if we want to compare our different interpretations of a dramatic element, I feel like if it's not somehow conceptual, then we're losing a little bit time. Okay, so going back to Damien's issue about the first sentence, well, we know, well, you know, later on people said that Plato worked on the first sentence and he rewrote it 1,000 times and whatever. In general, I do not like this kind of, you know, gymnastics. I find it to be, Plato is more interesting than, you know, just putting little bits here and there, because this road takes you to, I think it takes you to Straussianism and Straussianism by itself, in itself, it's not a sin, but even Straussians have a hard time coming into dialogue with one.
Well, it's a perfect answer to my question, because like, you know, I only know that reading of Plato. So I was curious like how you responded. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I just ask, I mean, book one has a lot of dramatic elements that are philosophically relevant, right? I mean, you know, it's a commentary on, I mean, at least there are interpretations where it's a commentary on the early Socratic method. Socrates, as you point out, is not a mouthpiece. He fails deliberately. Plato has him fail. He fails because he's dealing with a certain kind of interlocutor, Thrasymakhos. The whole of book one is like the perfect example of the dramatic elements having like a great deal of philosophical significance, right?
But yeah, exactly. But it's not because the first word is kateben. I don't think so. I think it's more interesting than that. I think there's this whole thing, you know? So just focusing on these little things, I had, you know, colleagues who would just count words to make it interesting. I think it's already interesting. It's interesting because justice is interesting. It's interesting because human psychology is interesting. It's not interesting because this guy comes from this city or whatever, but you see what I mean? It's hard to conceptualize it, but I think there are two extremes. One was maybe the Vlastos extreme, and now there is another extreme, and that is the over-particularization of dramatic elements.
How is it that over-particularization bad use of particulars? It's just people being speculative about particulars. They don't have good arguments, and they're just making stuff up about, you know, a word that happens to be here. Because I can imagine certainly places in Plato where, you know, a very particular dramatic element can be very important. But I can also imagine people talking a lot of bullshit about one, you know, word or one line.
Well, yeah. So my complaint, it's not really a complaint, but my point comes from the fact that this text is so rich that we can do a lot of stuff with it. And if you look at history, people have done so much with it. And people have read it in so many contradictory ways that, you know, I'm fine with any theory that you want to come up with. And I can probably find some details that would, you know, support it. But that brings us to relativism. And this book is too interesting and too nutritive to be lost in in these details. And I do think it's at the end of the day, it is about justice, and the state is involved in politics. I read books about the Republic saying that this is really not a book about politics. I mean, well, you know, isn't that too much? I mean, or that's the kind of complaint that I have. If we can say that, then we can say pretty much everything. And people have said everything about it anyway. But I don't want to take part of that. I want to, if I talk about a dramatic element, I want to be able to judge its explanatory power over a million other particular dramatic elements that I can pick. That's basically my criteria.
Welcome, Jeff Bow. Jeff was in a meeting, a terrible meeting. Hi, Jeff.
We have 2 minutes of Jeff.
Jeff maybe is not quite linked up there, the open truck, yeah. More questions? In the interest of this being our, yes?
Thank you. Ömer Hocam merhaba. Ben Türkçe düşünüp İngilizceye çevirdim. O yüzden İngilizce çevirisinde anlamadığınız bir yer olursa yani Türkçe kesip sorarsanız sevinirim. Olur mu?
Olur.
Teşekkür ederim. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for this beautiful and understandable presentation. I want to say some things first and then ask a question. You mentioned two aspects in Plato's dialogue, dogmatic and dramatic. And I understood from your presentation that an example of this is the relationship between Thrasymakhos and Socrates in Plato's Republic text. I wonder how important it is to have someone who opposes Socrates' ideas for advancing the conceptual debate about justice. Also, the positive progression of the dogmatic and dramatic sides seems to go together. The question I would like to ask is this. Does Thrasymakhos' ideas against Socrates actually have a significant effect on the definition reached by Socrates in the emergence of the definition reached as a result of the discussion of justice in the text? Or is the concluding proposition the definition of justice that Socrates, in fact Plato, had in mind before he wrote the dialogue in his text? Thrasymakhos seems to have accepted Socrates' conclusion because at the end of the text they become friends, you said. What is your opinion about this? Yani hocam aslında adaletin ne olduğunu açıklamak için Platon bunu bir kurgu halinde planlayıp öyle mi yazıyor yoksa bir doğaçlama mı yapıyor diyaloğu yazarken? Bunu merak ediyorum açıkçası. Teşekkür ederim.
Ben çok teşekkür ederim. Türkçe versiyonuna Türkçe cevap vereyim. Sonra çok kısaca İngilizce tekrarlarım. Ben doğaçlama olduğunu yani o anda yazdığını düşünmüyorum. Ben üzerine çok kafa yorduğunu, çeşitli versiyonları olduğunu tahmin ediyorum. Çünkü metin çok karmaşık ve çok ilginç. Yani o kadar karmaşık argümanlar var ki onları hediye oturup yazamazsınız, alta koyamazsınız. Çok büyük bir mimari olduğu çok açık. Çok da tuhaf bir mimari. Tamamen böyle tutarlı bir mimari değil, böyle parçalar var. 4-5 tane büyük parça var. Tamamen de entegre olmuyorlar. Çok tuhaf bir mimarisi var. Bence doğaçlama değil. I don't think it's an improvisation. The text is not improvised. It's very thought through. It's obviously there were many versions, many workings out. I think it must have taken him maybe decades, or a long stretch of time to come up with all the elements and all the little thoughts that come together. So it's a little bit of a life project or a midlife project, that sort of thing. It must have been pretty strong when he undertook it. But interestingly, Well, when I work on the translation or when I try to understand the text, I read very slowly, obviously. I think about things over and over again. Tekrar tekrar düşünüyorum. Çok yavaş okuyorum. İşte çevirirken, yorumlarken falan. Then I noticed that some people say this clearly, and probably scientifically this is arguable, that these texts were written aloud. They were read aloud. Bu metinler yüksek sesle okunuyordu. Yani Platon bunu yazarken birisi kütüphaneye kapanacak da bunu okuyacak diye yazmıyor olabilir. Birisi akşamüstü, akşam serinliğinde çocuğunu gezdirirken Atina'nın sokaklarında bir tanesi ayakta durmuş, işte Platon'un diyaloğunu okuyor diye yazmış da olabilir. Ve buna ilişkin bazı metinsel göstergeler var gerçekten. Yani bu kadar ağır çekimde okumamak belki de lazım. Platon bu kadar ağır çekimde okunması için yazmadı daha doğrusu belki de bunu. Diye bir kuşku içime düştü. Bazı yazarlar da bunu zaten söylüyorlar. Böyle bir durum var. Bence improvize değil, bence doğaçlama değil. Ama süper ağır çekimde bunu okumakta da belki Platon'un öngörmediği bazı şeyler olabilir diyeyim size. Bilmiyorum ne kadar cevap oldu. So my basic answer was that I don't think it's an improvisation, but there is a way in which we can overemphasize the close reading because there are some indications that these texts were meant to be read aloud. So you would go through book one in almost one stroke. It would take you, I don't know, 45 minutes or maybe half an hour, maybe 1 hour. But book one maybe it was written by Plato while he was imagining the reader not reading in a PhD a laboratory or a library, but maybe he was imagining something in the street, just listening to somebody reading the text. That sounds like a plausible idea. That the way Plato intended is not a good enough reason for us to read it that way, but I think it's an interesting mismatch between the way we imagine these texts should be read and the way Plato was imagining it. But Damien and Jeff...
So I guess like when you hear, for example, let's take the Phaedrus. You know, Phaedrus he's heard a speech, he's committed it to writing, he's going to commit it to memory. And he's heard a speech, but he's going to try to memorize that speech to then to tell, and he's going to say it many, many times, to tell Socrates in the very words what those speeches are. There's a whole thing about him hiding so I guess it seems to me like there's a lot that The Republic is a book that Plato intended to be read or to be listened to or memorized many, many times. So, I mean, which I guess would mean it could be, you know, what you're saying could be true, but the details could still be very, very important.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Jeffrey seems to agree on that. Yeah, when we read Aristotle's Poetics, the way he talks about Homer obviously shows that people were mulling over these texts like they were just reading it as slow as we could read anything. So maybe I should take that point back. I agree. Jeff?
Can I jump in?
Oh, please.
Hi, I'm very sorry, Omer, and perhaps I will say things that you've already addressed. I came late. I had a terribly boring meeting. I would only say that I wanted to come because I've always appreciated the things you said and the things Damien said. What I saw you discussing here, my thought was this. I've read certain accounts would say, this is, you know, if we read it the way it's presented, Socrates is recalling his own evening's experience. And some people have said, sort of in response to people like Popper, that this is the most democratic experience you can have. Socrates is able to take upon himself and report the voices of a Democrat and a tyrannical sophist and so many different people and recount his own experience of what that was like, you know? So when you look at back in book one, right, from that point of view, The reason I jumped in is because you're saying this is Plato's recollection, but Plato presents it to us as Socrates' recollection. I went down to the Piraeus, with Ariston.
I didn't say it was Plato's recollection. I didn't say that, but
No, I know that, and as I say, I jumped in late. But think about how Plato's presenting it. I mean, perhaps you already covered this, but the question becomes, are we meant to read this as one man's ability to encounter and address different points of view in the most democratic way possible? Perhaps that's my question. Not seeing the talk, for which I apologize.
No. Yeah, I'll just give you a 5-minute version later on. Yeah, I mean, it's true. That thing can be said about Socrates giving an account of the conversation he had the day ago. And there he presents all these positions democratically and so on and so forth. And I think that is also valid for Plato writing the dialogues in general. Because sometimes people who don't read Plato like to think that Plato is just having this fake boxing match between Socrates and some sophists, and Socrates just slapping them in the face and so on and so forth. And that just means that they don't read Plato. So similarly, I find Plato to have that same kind of democratic gesture, which people usually don't talk about. So in the Protagoras, the fact that Socrates and Protagoras end up switching positions, and Socrates recognizing this is already a testimony to the fact that Plato is not favoring Socrates, in the discussion over against the sophists. On the contrary, all those things. So this argument can also be applied partially to Plato's writership, so to speak. I don't know whether you agree, but yeah, that's a very, very good point.
Can I ask if there's other?
I'm just sorry I missed the whole talk.
Can I ask? I don't. At the time, I don't really know. Are there many dialogues that are introduced as Socrates' recollection?
Not many. Yeah. What's that?
Which one?
Which one, Jeff? No, you have to open the microphone. Open the microphone, Jeff.
Sorry, isn't the Theaetetus grounded in the idea the guy comes back buried and then Socrates remembers a conversation they had?
That's exactly what I was right. Yeah, and actually the Theaetetus is recounted by by two guys, I forget them, and they remember Socrates telling the story of Theaetetus. Theaetetus is wounded at the time, and Socrates says, "Oh, that boy, he was. Let me tell you how I met him." And they start talking about it. That's correct. So that's a flashback, a very long flashback that obviously spills into sophist and then the statesman, basically. So these are huge stretches of Socrates recollecting something that happened in the past.
If no one else, does anybody else have something to say? I was going to say, as a, because this is our first meeting, you said you distrust chronology, and I can see lots of reasons for that. But we know that Plato died. Plato was born around 428, 27, died around 348, 47. So it's about, he was about 30 when Socrates died in 399. He may have started writing before that, but not a lot before that probably. So we have, maybe about 50 years when he's writing his dialogues, right? From about 400 to when he died in 348. Can you give us any kind of general historical context for the Republic? Is it possible to do that? And particularly, I'd like you to clarify that Suda quote of Thrasymakhos. I missed that.
Yeah, the Suda has a very baffling line according to which Thrasymakhos would be the student of Plato and Isocrates. Do you know that, Jeff? I have to show you this. This is very mind-boggling. Maybe you know it. And the editors, Dylan and another editor, say that this is just preposterous. It cannot be true. It is very unlikely because Plato would be super younger than Thrasymakhos anyway, and it would be odd for such a young person to be the philosophical teacher of a guy who's as old as Socrates, probably. But anyhow, about the time frame. Well, one funny.
What is the quote?
From the Suda Encyclopedia, the 9th century Byzantine encyclopedia of the Suda, it says Thrasymakhos was a student, a philosophy student of Plato and Isocrates. Isocrates, the rhetor. And that is very, very odd. But with regard to the dating of the Republic, oh man, there's so many things. There are a couple of big problems. Which war of Megara they are talking about? I don't want to enter into this. I'm not that good at it. I looked at it 1,000 times. I forgot it 1,001 times. But Deborah Nails has a fantastic article about how the dramatic dating of the Republic just never make sense. It's just this crazy atemporal how do you say that? The timing, the chronology just doesn't add up. That guy shouldn't be living when that guy was around there, and that battle wouldn't have happened when that happened. So she shows all these inconsistencies with regard to the dramatic dating, and which is not the dating of the composition. It's very fun to look at because it shows what Plato is up to. I think he's not in. So chronology becomes this super erogatory level, as far as I can tell. And when you think about why people are so obsessed by the chronology, it's usually because they have a developmentalist idea, and that builds on their idea that these dialogues are doctrines, and it's just Plato saying stuff. And when he has contradictions, he must have changed his ideas. And that's not, I don't deal with contradictions that way. I don't think contradictions
Right.
Jeff has something to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Omer, this is a very astute point. John Burnett was one of those old school guys who said that this is a chronological attempt at Plato's therapy about the death of Socrates. And for a long time, people sort of accepted the Burnett interpretation. What I've been trying to say, and not to over exaggerate myself, but I've been trying to say that Plato moves freely between his obsession with the time in which he was born, because he knows it has an appeal in the collective memory of the society, and his own predilection for metaphor and aesthetic, and emotional appeal, from which he moves from chronology into much more metaphor. And that Nails has shown very directly, as you point out, that Plato has a purpose in appealing to chronology to a point, but past the point, he will move to things that are much more interesting to him, which are metaphorical and artistic.
That's right. One thing that I would add to this is that Plato, if he's writing in the, 390, 380, 370, 360, he usually seems to be putting the stage in a retro manner. So he's usually talking about the end of the 5th century. So the key, I think, in understanding his obsessions, as Jeff was saying, is to understand the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. That's the key, I think. The Peloponnesian War and what happened there, and the aftermath, and obviously Socrates. That's his thing, that he constantly seems to be orbiting that world, which is, Socrates' trial and everything else. He doesn't seem to be talking about stuff that is much later, after Socrates' death, dramatically. Usually things happen when Socrates is either young or he's old or he's about to die. So it's usually around, I don't know, 430 to 399 or something like that. That stretch corresponds roughly with the Peloponnesian War, and that is his obsession, and that is what is reflected in the Republic every now and then, not that it's chronologically consistent.
Okay. If there are anyone else want to jump in? We've gone over a little bit, which is fine. Nali, did you say? No. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming. I think this is wonderful. Omer, it was just delightful.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was so nice. And thanks everybody for your contributions. Maybe I might have sounded a little bit more authoritative sounding or more confrontational. I'm really sorry.